Well, good afternoon, everyone. The mind-boggling pace of the Senate at the beginning of this year is certainly astonishing. I don't think I've ever seen a slower beginning at the start of a new Congress in the Senate, but we're not in the majority, and so I'll let Senator Schumer, when he comes back, answer that question. With regard to the searches for classified documents, I think the bipartisan request of Chairman Warner and Vice Chairman Rubio is entirely reasonable. What they're asking for here would not interfere with these ongoing criminal investigations, and I hope the administration will come up with a better answer than no, which is apparently what both the chairman and the vice chairman were told recently. Their request to find out exactly what kind of documents were in improper custody seems to me squarely within their oversight mission on the Intel Committee, and I want to commend both of them for pursuing this in a bipartisan way.
Next week, the President will come up and make a State of the Union speech to the Congress, and it'll be an opportunity for all of us to examine his last year in office, his first 2 years in office, and I think one thing that the American people are obviously feeling is the impact of his policies with respect to inflation. And if you look at overall inflation, it's 13.5% increase in the cost of everything since this president took office, but more particularly if you look at food, which is where a lot of people experience that cost, it's much higher than that. It's 18.6% increase in the cost of food since President Biden took office. For basic items like eggs, 60% increase, 30% increase for butter, 24% increase for lettuce. And so these are the types of costs that the American people are experiencing on a daily basis. And I hope the President will address that issue and what he intends to do to address this rampant inflation that is been so harmful to the pocketbooks of everyday Americans. As we think about the cost of food and those who produce it, this is a Farm Bill year, and that's an issue that's incredibly important to me. South Dakota, our agriculture is our #1 industry in South Dakota, and so as we get into the Farm Bill debate this year, I'm going to be very focused on making sure that we have a Farm Bill in place that is good for American agriculture and good for American consumers. And that really starts with making sure that consumers know where their food is coming from, where it originated. One of the things I hear from folks across South Dakota is the importance of all our food products, but in particular beef, knowing its origin. And if you think about the beef that you buy in the supermarket today, at the grocery store today, in many cases, the only thing American about it may be the plastic that it's wrapped in, if that. And so I've introduced now the American beef labeling system, which would require mandatory country of origin labeling for beef so that the American consumer will know where their beef is coming from. And I hope to have that included in the next Farm Bill. And I hope that the President, in his State of the Union speech this week, takes a hard look and talks about those things that he intends to do to make life easier, not harder, and less expensive, not more expensive, for the American people who, for the past 2 years, have been experiencing the very harmful impacts of his inflationary policies.
Our nation's debt is now over $31 trillion. This is a staggeringly high number. It is larger than the size of our nation's economy. We have maxed out our credit cards, and we did it in just a little over a year from the last time we raised the debt ceiling. The interest on the debt alone is $400 billion right now, which is more money than we spend on veterans issues, including veterans' retirements. And this is all a result, this fact that we're hitting it so soon after just raising it, is a result of a single party in 2 years doing massive amounts of spending. It's over $3 trillion in the last 2 years, and even more than that when you consider executive actions. As a result of all of this spending, we had a 40-year high inflation. Interest rates have now been had to raised 7 different times. So credit card interests are up. Interest on car loans is up. Interest on mortgage is up. People are paying more, and they are hurting as a result of this. We have to stop spending money that we do not have. It needs to stop. So the question is, how do we responsibly deal with the debt ceiling at a time of irresponsible spending by the Democrats? We're not going to default on the debt. We need to find a way, though, to tie together raising the debt ceiling with changes in reforms and reining in our spending. It's the only way to get our economy back on track. Now, President Biden has said people like me who are concerned about the size of the debt and the spending, he said, are fiscally demented. Well, he has people in his administration and at the White House who want to eliminate a debt ceiling entirely. Say, no, we don't need it at all, including his Treasury Secretary. To me, that is dangerous, it's irresponsible, it's fiscally reckless. So 24 Republican senators have signed and sent a letter to the president saying, if you want us to vote for raising the debt ceiling, we have to have fundamental reform in the way that spending is done. We've done this before. Going back to 1985, we've done this 8 different times where we've tied reforms to raising the debt ceiling. And 2/3 of the American people absolutely believe that we should tie reforms to spending to raising the debt ceiling, because it's the only way to get our failing economy back on track.
January 31st, 2016. There was a young Council Bluffs woman who had just graduated from Bellevue University with a 4.0. She was so excited about her future. She was celebrating with friends. She was in her car and stopped at a stoplight. She was struck by a man who was street racing 70 miles per hour, struck the car from the rear, killed her. Her name was Sarah Root. Her killer was an illegal immigrant named Edwin Mejia. Edwin Mejia was allowed to post bond and fled before Sarah was ever laid in the ground. It was because of a loophole that exists in our code, which requires local authorities to release people after a certain length of time if the federal government doesn't feel they need to be detained. We're going to close up that loophole with Sarah's Law, which I am reintroducing today. Our federal government should require that someone who is an illegal immigrant and has seriously injured or killed another person to be detained so that the families of the fallen can seek justice. It's common sense, folks. Edwin Mejia is free. He is free somewhere, and we have no idea where. And yet, Michelle Root, Sarah's mother, and Scott Root, her father, and Scotty, Sarah's little brother, they wonder every single day if they will ever see justice. This is very personal to me, and I've gotten to know the family quite well over the past 7 years. There are many other families that suffer from these tragedies, and they don't receive justice. The United States is where we should be able to find justice. And I am asking my colleagues to support Sarah's Law. Let's move it this year. Congressman Randy Feenstra of Iowa has the lead in the House, and we hope we can see success. So God bless Sarah Root and her family.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to talk just briefly about what the two Johns talked about, which is the middle class squeeze that we've seen over the last 2 years under the the Biden presidency, excuse me. We see over 13% inflation. We see mortgages up over 7% now. Any wage increases that we see across the country are totally wiped out by the increased cost of goods. When you see the cost of energy, even though it's slightly come down most recently, it's still many, many more times more expensive than it was before President Biden took over. But I guess the food one is the one that really gets me. So if you think about it in your own mind, everybody goes to the grocery store and you kind of approximate in your mind what you're going to spend, unless you're having a big party on Friday night or something like that. Whether you have a family of two, like we're down to now, or if you have a larger family with younger children where you would have obviously a bigger budget. But you kind of have in your mind what it's going to be. And every single week, it's always more. It creeps up $2, $3, $4, $5 more. Before you know it, it's double. And this is really putting the squeeze. Our inboxes are filled with people from all across the country, mine from West Virginia, of the mother of young children. She's up all night because she can't figure out, how am I going to pay for the food? How am I going to pay to heat the house? We have a guy who is paying more to heat his house than he is to pay his mortgage that he had pre-Biden, but he's also trying to help his neighbors pay their heating bills because it's skyrocketed so much. So every day Americans, every working American, everybody who buys food, puts gas in the tank, pays for a house, pays to heat their house, is feeling this squeeze. And the president better address it. He hasn't. He needs to address it. I hope, as John Thune said, he addresses it in his address next week.
Senate Democrats joined President Biden in green-lighting these multi-trillion-dollar, purely partisan spending extravaganzas over the last 2 years. It was 2 years ago, about this time, we started seeing the Democrats' proposals on a purely partisan, massive spending proposals and tax increases. In fact, even Democrats from the Obama administration were warning that if this legislation were to pass, it would have inflationary effects. Well, now we see those effects. I recently went and filled up my pickup in Montana one night with my sweet wife. It's over $100 to fill up my pickup. Grocery prices up 18.6% since this president took office. When you look at what that means for Montanans, that's over $10,000 more being paid for groceries, for food, for housing than when President Biden took office. Now, make no mistake, if Nancy Pelosi were still Speaker of the House, the Senate right now would be getting ready to put in play, with Chuck Schumer's leadership, another reconciliation bill. They would have more spending and more taxes. The only thing holding them back is the fact there's a slim Republican majority in the House. And regarding the debt ceiling, we cannot default on our debt. But I would submit to you all here today that if there was a Republican president with a Democrat-controlled House, I think the media would be talking about and expecting the president to negotiate with the Speaker. And I hope we have fair play here, because President Biden's position of not negotiating on the debt ceiling in terms of putting some common sense spending reforms in place going forward is, as Senator Barraza mentioned, this has been done 8 times since 1985 with a debt ceiling discussion and spending reforms. We need to do the same thing now.
Mr. Leader.
Yeah.
Thank you. You seemed to indicate a couple of weeks ago that you were going to let President Biden and the Speaker try to work something out on the debt ceiling here. That said, you've also indicated that you don't think that we will default, but in 2011, because we strung this out so close to the deadline, S&P actually marked down the United States. Is there concern that if you and others don't get involved in this sooner rather than later, we could be in a similar situation there and have this drama actually cause problems?
Yeah, no, I don't have any concern. I negotiated the deal in 2011. I remember it fully. And my negotiating partner was then Vice President Joe Biden. And it actually worked if your goal was to reduce spending. And it actually did reduce spending for a couple of years in a row for the first time since right after the Korean War. The problem was it was too impactful on defense for Republicans and too impactful on the domestic side for Democrats, and gradually we agreed to walk away. But getting beyond the history lesson, as others have said here today, it's not unprecedented to have a discussion about spending in connection with the debt ceiling. Obviously, from our perspective, that needs to be led by the Speaker. They're in the majority. The President knows full well, since he was a negotiating partner years ago, that this has been done before. And I think the deal has to be cut, obviously, between the House majority and the Democratic President in order to have a chance to survive over here. So we're all behind Kevin and wishing him well in the negotiation.
Leader McConnell, you did not sign on to this letter that 24 of your colleagues, including a couple members of your leadership team, that said that any increase in the debt ceiling must be accompanied by cuts equal or greater to the amount of the debt ceiling increase.
Yeah,
do you not agree with that position?
I wouldn't read too much into it. There are letters floating around in our conference all the time. Most of the time I don't sign them.
Mr. Leader McConnell, how concerned are you by this prediction by Air Force General Minahan that we could be in a war with China within 2 years over Taiwan? And are we doing enough to deter the Chinese from attacking Taiwan? I'm thinking in terms of our reconstituting forces in Okinawa and now possibly setting up military bases in the Philippines.
Yeah. Look, it's not confusing. The Japanese Prime Minister said, if you want to push back against President Xi, beat Putin in Ukraine. We need to have a total focus on defeating the Russians in Ukraine. Boris Johnson was just in my office. I know he's running around the Capitol today earlier. That's certainly not only his view, but the view of the government in the UK. And Putin has produced widespread unity among NATO that didn't actually exist before his invasion. So I think President Xi is watching this. In the meantime, we need to work with the Taiwanese to make sure that they purchase from us the military equipment that they actually need as a deterrent to a potential effort by the mainland to engage in a military activity. So I think that's what we need to do with the Taiwanese, make sure they're adequately armed, they can pay for it, and beat Putin in Ukraine.